Good morning, welcome back to day two. We will be starting with our first panel, which will be introduced by Hinde who is a graduate student in the Slavic department, has been really key for organizing this conference. Yes, so we'll have our introduction.
Thank you. Good morning, allemaal. I am Hinde, in case you haven't met me, but I feel like I've met most of you by this point. And thank you to Professor Torres as well for introducing me. I wanted to introduce very, very briefly and succinctly the second day of Yiddish Ecologies, following the paths opened by yesterday's panelists into the questions that might surface again today. Before I do so, I would like to formally thank our sponsors once again, the Franke Center for the Humanities, the Joyce Z. and Jacob Greenberg Center for Jewish Studies, the Joseph S. Pinkert Memorial Fund, the Bonnie Kaplan Fund for Yiddish Language, Culture, and History, and the Departments of German, Slavic, and Comparative Literature. So just to give one thread that came up yesterday for me across all of the talks was the idea of the limit or boundary. So we have the Sambation River that links medieval mythologies to Bordedulin's imagination of a future predicated on the disturbing regulation of health, immigration, and the other, presented by Auden Finch, the cacti boundaries that bear witness to and scream out in the ethnically cleansed villages in Mann's work and on the pages of the Palestinian memory books explored by Aisha Beirich, Ernest Burgess's concentric zones and limits of urban life and topography that Cecile Kuznets maps under her study of the Vilna sheep houses, the blurring of boundaries between human, Jewish, and built that Mendel Cohen locates in Kulbach, Avram Golem's work against the limits of Yiddish nature vocabulary as a, quote, maximally Jewish, Yiddish, and secular pedagogical practice described by Caleb Scher, and the limits of forms such as the romantic ballad after the Holocaust that Hannah Pauline Galad addressed in her discussion of Chava Rosenfar's writing. So with that, today in our three panels on ecofeminism and gender studies, poetics of landscape, and animal, perhaps we can continue to consider the limits that operate on, are delineated by, and resisted within the Yiddish spaces, landscapes, and habitats we're encountering. And to bring back the guiding question from yesterday, posed by Professor Torres, discuss how these limits might circumscribe and configure ecology as a keyword for our purposes. Thank you, and with that, I will bring up Professor Eckin from the Slavic department to moderate our first panel.
I'm Eckin. I won't take too much of time away from the panel, but I just wanted to say real quickly that I'm a Yiddishist, but not a Yiddish scholar. I'm a Slavist. What I just wanted to say was thank you for the intentionality that has gone into this conference. And the deep thought that you've put already into the papers that I've heard already, the intentionality that went into the program has been reflected in your contributions to it, including the musical program last night, which in and of itself, was a dialogue with your papers and with the ideas in this conference. So I'm really grateful. It felt like I internalized some of the ideas just by observing the music last night. I also take 90 seconds to say that as a Slavist, one of the ideas that I was really engaged with yesterday was the way in which many of you were reinterpreting Mikhail Bakhtin's idea of heteroglossia, and insofar as Slavists share a space with Yiddish text, Slavic text and Yiddish text share a space, I wanted not just you to think about the ways in which Bakhtin, one important part of Bakhtin's idea is that not just multi-vocality, but also the ways in which voices and speech acts are in constant dialogue, are aware of the other. So think not just about limits, but interconnections and the way in which the voices, in which Aisha so beautifully incorporated the non-human voices as well, the way in which the non-human and natural voices interact with all of our texts. It's been really generative for me to think about that. I know it's also going to be super generative for me to think with the three papers that we have today. And I'm going to, as yesterday, refer you to the program for the biographies of our wonderful speakers today. And I'll read the three names and papers, and then we'll flow directly into your contributions. So first we have Hinde Ena Burstin's Der Ruder von khvayles, the churning of the waves, nature motifs in Shifre Kholodenko's poetic cycle on menstruation. And Hinde will be joining us via Zoom. Then we'll have Carolyn Beard's paper, Sorrow and the Samovar, Reading Gender and Landscape in Itzik Manger's Ruth cycle. And finally, we'll have Hannah Sewell's paper, Beehives and Birdsong, Animals and the Making of New Women in Alexandra Kollontai and Jens Serdatsky's fiction. So with that, we're going to get set up for Zoom.
Shalom Aleichem, good morgen. I mean really good morgen because it's 2:30 in the morning here in now Melbourne, Australia. Yeah, okay. I'd like to begin by respectfully acknowledging the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation as the traditional custodians of the unceded lands where I live and from where I'm presenting today. I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. I also pay my respects to the traditional custodians of the lands where you, the audience, find yourselves today. I'd like to express my deep appreciation to the wonderful Yiddishists at University of Chicago for conceptualizing and organizing this conference, Yiddish Ecologies, Velder, Felder, Berg und Toll, which addresses such a significant aspect of Yiddish life and literature. It's such an honor for me to be part of this conference, where I'll speak on the topic Der Ruder von khvayles, the churning of the waves, nature motifs in Shifre Kholodenko's poetic cycle on menstruation. I'm sorry that I'm not able to be freezing in Chicago with you. Chicago is, however, very much with me, as it is thanks to a wonderful Chicago publication, actually my favorite book in the world, Antologie Jiddische Dichterins, or Jiddische Dichterins Antologie, Anthology of Yiddish Women Poets, which was published in Chicago in 1928. And it's thanks to this anthology that I first became acquainted with Shifre Kholodenko's poetry, including her nature cycles. I'd also like to, at this point, it's so wonderful to see Anna again, and thank you. I think I've done 3 conferences recently, and this is the one where my name was actually pronounced correctly, so thank you. It's a real honor. And yeah, I hope you understand me. I'm very, very tired. Okay. The poet Shifre Kholodenko was born in 1909 in a rural village in the Volyn region of Ukraine. She came from a very religious background. Her grandfather, Akivele, was a rabbi and a melamed, a teacher of traditional and religious Jewish studies for young boys. Her love of Yiddish literature was nurtured in her highly literary home. Shifre Kholodenko grew up in a large family. She and her 10 siblings all worked the land that the family owned in the rural village. Kholodenko's early contact with nature had a strong impact on her, and she continued to study and work with nature throughout her life. After finishing high school, she studied in an agricultural college in Moscow and then traveled to Crimea to work on the land. Thereafter, she returned to Moscow, where she studied in the physics and mathematics faculty of the Moscow University. She graduated as a geodesist. Geodesists measure geodynamic phenomena, including gravity and tides. As you will hear when I read Kholodenko's poem, Alle Chodesh, every month, she felt a strong personal connection to tides from a young age. Nature themes are a significant and recurring motif in Kholodenko's work. Like many newly secularized poets, Kholodenko retained a sense of the wondrousness of the natural world. and developed a spiritual connection with nature that was devoid of religious concepts of God. Shifre Kholodenko made her literary debut in 1922 with the publication of 2 Yiddish poems in the Moscow Art and Literature Journal Strom Heute Journal, or Currents Monthly Journal. These 2 poems, As meine Freuden, As My Joys, and Es wird in mir wachsen, Inside Me Will Grow, appeared in volume 48, number 3 of Strom. As I noted earlier, you may have noted also, Shifre Kholodenko was born in 1909, meaning that these poems were published when she was 13 years old. She also published in the same year poems in the Kharkiv poetry collections Zum Sieg, To Victory, and Jugend, Youth, among others. Thereafter, she was widely published in Soviet Yiddish periodicals and in Almanach Ukraine, Ukraine Almanac in Kiev, published in Kiev in 1926. And later, in 1928, her work was included in Jiddische Dichterins Antologie, Anthology of Yiddish Women Poets, which was edited by Ezra Corman and published in Chicago in 1928. Shifre Kholodenko's first poetry collection, Leben, or Life, was published in Kiev in 1937. This was followed by her poetry collection, Dorten, or There, in 1940, her short story collection, Ganz früh, Quite Early, also published in 1940, and her poetry collection, Unsere Kraft, Our Strength, published in 1947. Like many Yiddish writers living under Stalin's repressive regime, she did not publish any further books between 1947 and her death in 1974. A posthumous collection of Kholodenko's work was published in 1974. This volume, with the title Das Wort, the Word, comprised 163 pages and recognize and attest to Kholodenko's unique and substantial contribution to Ukrainian Yiddish literature. Kholodenko was widely anthologized and discussed during her lifetime, but is not well known today. From a very young age, Kholodenko's brilliance as a poet was clear. Between the ages of 13 and 19, Kholodenko published a cycle of poems about the menstrual cycle. These poems take the reader viscerally into the speaker's body, depicting hormonal fluctuations and physical sensations with an openness that defied taboos around this silenced topic. Kholodenko's menstrual poems link this cycle to the natural world, the moon, the ocean, the sap of a pine tree, and red flowering blossoms. Connecting menstruation with nature repositions menstrual cycles as natural and wondrous, a radical reinterpretation that liberates this cycle from its religious connection with impurity and shame and returns it to its natural place of reverence and respect. These visceral poems defy Kholodenko's own pious upbringing in rural Ukraine and repeated that line. I will now share 2 of the poems from the cycle along with my translations, and I welcome your feedback on my translations. So the first one I'll share with you is called Alle Chodesh. Alle Chodesh häupt die Levone die Wasser von irdische Bregen, herrich dem Ruder von khvayles in frisch rohen Ort von mein Leben. Und Herren, still warme Fallen, Tropfen, gesalzene Jammen. Ich fiel heint dem Onheib, dem Weiten, von Odem mit Chaven. And my translation, Every month the moon raises the water from its earthly shores. In the fresh, raw place of my life, I can hear the waves roar, and quiet, warm tears fall, drops of salty seas. I feel the distant beginning today of Adam and Eve. And I'm just going to mention I've retained the Soviet spelling, and because I think that's important to do, and Soviet orthography in Yiddish. And I'll go straight into the next poem in the cycle, which is called Mein Blut. Mein Blut, mein warm Blut. Ich hab heint geweint, ich hab heint gelacht. Und als gewahrt, auf was, auf wen. Und nicht gewusst, von wannen kommt a Samen Freud zu mir in Herz. Bis wannens hat a Tropfen Blut, der zeltem Sod in tiefer Nacht. My blood, my warm blood, today I laughed, today I cried, and still I waited. For what? For when? And did not know from where. Such joy came into my heart until a drop of blood told the secret in deep night. These bold and innovative poems tackle a taboo that is still rarely discussed 100 years later. These poems are deeply rooted within the political, cultural, and literary imperatives of the time, yet remain relevant and powerful today. Kholodenko's poems were published during a time of changing cultural landscapes, with increased literacy among young Jewish women, leading to greater publication of Yiddish writing by women. Secularization, along with women's growing agency, empowered Yiddish women poets to expand the themes and subjects of their writing. And this was particularly the case for Yiddish women writers in Ukraine who were so bold and so innovative. Despite these advances, menstruation is still spoken about in euphemism. Cultural messages depict menstruation as unclean and shameful and dictate that it must be hidden. Kholodenko rescues this hiddenness from shame, reframing it as a wondrous mystery intrinsically connected with the universe. In doing so, she straddles this time of transition in Yiddish life and literature. In her poem Alle Chodesh, she evokes the tradition of Rosh Chodesh and the symbolism of Adam and Eve, while jettisoning religious associations of uncleanliness and shame around menstruation. In another poem in the cycle that I don't have time to share today, Ich bin full, or I am full, the speaker expresses unabashed pride and overflowing joy in the sensations of menstruation, an approach that is still unique today. From a literary perspective, these poems conform to and subvert the expectation that women should write about nature, as was espoused by Aleph Glantz, Shmuel Charney, and other leading editors, critics, and literary powerbrokers of the time, who imposed this imperative in gatekeeping what would and would not be published. Kholodenko challenges this rigid imposition, subverting the expectation that dichterins must write about nature by utilizing ecological imagery to illuminate secularization, sexuality, and body autonomy. Her poems display modernist affects of mystery and interiority, making public what had previously been kept private. Kholodenko's early poems were written in a time of Yiddish literary explosion in general, and particularly in the Soviet Union, where state support enabled extensive Yiddish publishing. Post-revolution, The state supported the development of ethnic languages and secular cultures and provided funding for Yiddish schools, research institutes, newspapers, periodicals, publishing houses, and theatres. Yiddish cultural institutions were intent on fostering a secular, post-revolution Yiddish culture. Avant-garde Yiddish writers set alight all bridges that led to the old world. Soviet Yiddish women writers published intensely intimate poems that rejected the laws and mores that had policed their bodies, treating them as sites of secrecy and shame. These intimate poems both assert bodily autonomy and signify these writers' changing relationship with their corporality. While many women wrote about free sexual relationships, Kholodenko is unique in writing about menstruation. These poems subvert religious Jewish expectations. They are simultaneously in keeping with the expectations of the state in their rejection of religious imperatives and practices. Thus, they are very much a product of their time. Silencing and taboos around menstruation have persisted 100 years after these poems were first published. Thus, these poems are both of and beyond their time. The use of nature imagery gives them broad and relatable appeal, ensuring that these unique poems remain relevant and powerful today. Shifre Kholodenko was a bold and innovative Yiddish poet who continued to live in the Soviet Union until her death in 1974. She continued to write poetry after the purges of Soviet Yiddish writers, including her brother, David Hofstein, who was the first of the murdered Yiddish poets. So she continued to live in the Soviet Union and continued to write poetry, but did not publish her work. After her death, many Yiddish poems were found in the drawer of her writing desk. Nature remained a significant motif in her writing. I'm currently translating more of Kholodenko's poems on Velder, Felder, Berg, Tollen, Levonis, und Jammen, and I hope to share these with you in the future. A herzlichen Dank. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So, well, good morning, folks. Before I begin, this morning, I want to offer a brief content warning. About 12 minutes into this presentation, there's a brief discussion of suicide. As Itzik Manger's Ruth cycle begins, Shabbos draws to a close. Nomi prays in the stub and catches sight of the old mill. Her husband, Elimelech, had once purchased and worked the mill, but her husband and sons are now dead. Nomi hadn't approved of her sons' matches, but she has since grown fond of Orpah and Ruth. She saw how much they loved her boys, how they had worked the fields side by side. With memories of her deceased husband and sons imprinted in the landscape around her, even when in the company of her dear, light-haired daughters-in-law, Nomi feels alone in a foreign land. In his 1940 Ruth cycle, noted Yiddish poet Itzik Manger reimagines the biblical narrative of Ruth against the landscape of 19th and 20th century Eastern Europe. In her 2022 biography of the Book of Ruth, feminist biblical scholar Ilana Pardes reads the text as a migrant tale. While Pardes explores multiple afterlives of the text, its reception in Yiddish literature, and particularly in Manger's retelling, was outside the scope of her research. I hope that this project may help to fill that lacuna. What I seek to demonstrate today is that where the biblical narrative is silent, Manger offers portraits of women's internal experiences of loss and grief while living in a foreign land. While the land serves as a site of grief, it is ultimately in and through the land that women encounter the divine. I first encountered Manger's Ruth cycle in the 2022 winter semester. It just so happened that the 3 students enrolled in the advanced Yiddish class at Harvard University were all classmates at the Divinity School. We all had interests in the role and representation of religion in Yiddish literature. And so, under the supervision of Dr. Sora Miriam Feldman, we engaged in a collaborative translation of Manger's Ruth cycle. I thank my collaborators for their permission to use our translation as I present my own research today. Before we turn to Manger's cycle, I want to offer a few words on the biblical text. A short piece of historical fiction written during the Persian period, Ruth follows the story of the woman Nomi, who leaves Judah to make a home in Moab, a foreign land. Nomi's husband Elimelech dies, and her sons marry 2 Moabite women. Soon after, her sons die as well, and Nomi is left alone with her 2 daughters-in-law, Orpah and Ruth. Nomi decides to return to her homeland, and she gives Orpah and Ruth her blessing for them to return to their own people. While Orpah departs, Ruth says the words so immortalized by Carol King, "Where you lead, I will follow." Nomi and Ruth go to Judah and take residence near Nomi's closest kin, the landowner Boaz. Ruth gleans in Boaz's fields, and Nomi plots for Ruth to ensnare Boaz in marriage. Ruth meets Boaz on the threshing floor, and he takes Ruth as his wife. Ruth bears a son, and Nomi celebrates becoming a grandmother. The story ends with the genealogy connecting Boaz with David. And so central themes of the story are living among strangers and return to the homeland, social, economic, and land justice, Levite marriage and the responsibility of the next of kin, marriage, reproduction, and widowhood, and the continuation of a royal family line. Noted for his adaptations of biblical texts, Manger wrote his Ruth cycle in 1940 while living in North Africa. First published in 1942, the cycle is prefaced with an important caveat that the text is fragmentary or incomplete. As Manger indicated in an author's note, 2/3 of the poem were lost during my wandering and travels. This is reiterated in the parenthetical that immediately precedes the first poem of the cycle, which again identifies the cycle as a fragment or an incomplete text. And so we see here biographical resonances with themes of the narrative. Manger wrote the poems while living in a foreign land, and he lost manuscripts during his movement and wandering during his own migration. As Manger's cycle begins, Nomi, Orpah, and Ruth are 3 widows living in a foreign land. Nomi recounts her family's experience of coming to the foreign land, her sons' marriages to women from the local community, and the deaths of her husband and sons. Around them, the women are reminded of the men that they have loved and lost. The mill that Elimelech bought now creaks in the wind. The fields that Orpah and Ruth had worked with their partners lay fallow. Over hot tea poured from the Samovar, Nomi tells her daughters-in-law that she wants to return to her homeland in the morning, and she gives them her blessing to return to their own homes. The women are unable to fall asleep the night before their journey, and they each reflect on what the next day will hold. Manger's cycle ends as the women begin their journey to Nomi's homeland. And so, as you can see, Manger's text generally aligns with the biblical narrative of Ruth, or at least the first section of it. Manger replicates the basic outline of the biblical narrative. He also follows the text's focus not on Ruth, but on Nomi. Right? Nomi is the primary agent. Nomi directs action, and we see this in Manger's cycle. As of the 8 surviving poems, 4 of them are from Nomi's perspective. And there are certainly thematic similarities between these texts. As Catherine Hallerstein writes, though fragmentary, the extant Ruth poems convey the sense of the whole, for they center on the themes of leaving home, of living in the fremd, in the foreignness, and of longing to return home. But this is where the similarities end. Manger, of course, changes the setting of the cycle, which is now placed in 19th and 20th century Eastern Europe. And we can read Manger's setting as commentary on the long history of forced migration and movement of Jewish and minority communities in Eastern Europe, including his own migratory experience at the time. And Manger does not follow the exact narrative structure of the biblical text. Instead, he expands the narrative where the book of Ruth is otherwise silent, or he imagines and interprets what the biblical narrative only gestures towards. Manger's cycle represents a very small portion of the book of Ruth. And so to give a sense of this, on this slide, I have placed side by side the poems from Manger's Ruth cycle with their correlating verses from the biblical text. We know that Manger's text is fragmentary, but this still shows us that Manger's 8 poems represent only the first 14 verses of the book of Ruth, and that 3.5 chapters of the biblical narrative are not represented. And so what's unique about these first 14 verses, and particularly the first 5 verses, is that these are the only verses in the book of Ruth where Nomi and her family are living in a foreign land. What this shows us is that Manger's Ruth cycle is particularly concerned about the themes that are found in this opening section of the biblical text, and those themes are loss, grief, and living in a foreign land. Manger expands the beginning of the book of Ruth, offering reflections on the character's internal experiences that aren't found in the biblical text. In the biblical narrative, the first 5 verses function as exposition. This text gives us dates, names, and places, but it doesn't tell us how these women encounter grief or how these women navigate the uncertainty of the migratory experience. Once the women begin their journey in verse 6, and once the women begin to leave the foreign land, then we are given a window into the women's interiority. There is dialogue and narration of internal experiences. But the biblical narrative of Ruth does not actually represent the women's internal experience of life in a foreign land. And so this is what Manger does. Manger speaks into the silences of the biblical story. He offers exegesis or interpretation of expository material. And in particular, Manger presents the interiority of these women. Manger imagines what it was like for Nomi, Ruth, and Orpah to be living in a strange land, to be surrounded by signs of their deceased partners, and to long for a faraway home. And so for Manger, women experience both grief and divine revelation in and through the foreign land. In Manger's opening poem, which we have already seen, Elimelech, Nomi's husband, is only invoked when Nomi catches sight of the mill. The mill stands as a reminder of her deceased husband, of a time before his death. It used to be an active mill, but now, even in the cool evening wind, its blades barely breathe. As Nomi thinks about the women who are in the room with her, her mind is drawn to the fields outside And she remembers a time when her sons had worked those fields with their wives. And so here there's a strong association between land and loss, and land serves as a reminder of time that has passed, the lives that have been lost. And because of their grief, women also experience estrangement from the land. In the second poem of the cycle, after Nomi tells Orpah and Ruth that she wants to return home, they sit in silence over cups of hot tea poured from the Samovar. From inside the stube, the women can hear the song of a local woman dressed as the night sky, who sings out a song of love for the foreigner, for the foreign land, for the friend. This song echoes through the land, over the river, field, and forest. But for Nomi, Orpah, and Ruth, the song is insufficient or lacking. They are unable to join in the song, and instead they sit in silence, and the only sound in the stube is the buzz of the Samovar. Lost in their grief, the women are unable to praise or express gratitude for the land. They are unable to join in the sweet song that extols and echoes through the landscape around them. The land is not only a site and source of grief, but also a beacon of death. In the poem Ruth Cannot Sleep, Ruth reflects on Nomi's upcoming journey. Ruth has no home to go back to, but she is unsure whether Nomi will allow her to stay by her side. Ruth hears the roar of the river, and the river beckons her to join its murky depths. Calling her pet names, the river asks Ruth to be its wife, to be its rutzalka, to be a malicious siren or water nymph. The river promises to give Ruth what she wants the most in the world, a home. And so Ruth makes a decision. If she is unable to accompany Nomi, I have an Apple ID notification, just so you know, on the computer. Okay. Okay. So if Ruth is unable to accompany Nomi, she decides she's going to enter the river's murky depths and become a water nymph. So here, prompted by grief over the loss of her husband, her family, and home, Ruth creates a plan to commit suicide. To her, the land is not only a site of loss and grief, but it functions as an instrument to hasten her own death. Without a home abroad, without a home to return to, Ruth feels that she may finally find a home in the river, a home in final death. So while the land functions for Nomi, Orpah, and Ruth as a site of loss and grief, it is also in and through the land that the women also receive divine revelation. And we see this in the third poem of the cycle, Nomi Cannot Sleep. Nomi lies in bed sleepless, and her eyes are drawn to 3 bright and faithful stars that glisten in the night sky. Nomi reflects on how these stars seem so strange, even though she knows that these are the same stars as those at home. Nomi realizes that it is under these stars in this land that she has buried her dead. It is here that she wept over her dead sons' corpses. As she wavers about whether to make the journey home, Nomi hears the corpses of her husband and sons crying out to her from within the land. They command her to stay with them, to stay in the land where she has buried them under fine soil and loam. Startled by this experience, Nomi cries out and asks God for guidance. Nomi hears the wind roar in the nearby apple orchard, and suddenly the divine is revealed to her. God speaks to Nomi. God tells Nomi that God does not reside among the dead, but lives in the land where she was born. God commands Nomi to get up in the morning and to go back to her homeland. At last validated in her decision to depart, Nomi falls asleep to the sound of the wind rustling in the orchard. So in this poem, the land is once again a sign and sigil of grief. The corpses of the dead cry out to Nomi from the land, and from beneath the earth, from under the soil and loam, and they demand that she stays with them. And here our translation of corpses was quite contested. We chose corpses by metonymy, but really this could also be translated as graves. So it's the pits, it's the open wounds in the land that are calling out to Nomi. But it is also through the land, through the earth, that God reveals God's self to Nomi, right? It's in the wind that roars and rustles through the nearby apple orchard that God speaks. This invokes a long tradition of theophany, the revelation or appearance of God occurring through nature. When we think of the burning bush, the clouds of smoke, pillars of fire, and most importantly, of God's revelation to Job out of a whirlwind. And so here, Manger places Nomi within a long lineage of the esteemed people to whom God has revealed God's self. So in his Ruth cycle, Manger imagines and interprets Nomi, Orpah, and Ruth's experience of grief in a foreign land. The land serves a double function. It is both a site and source of grief, and the instrument through which God is revealed to the women. As our time with these texts draws to a close, I want to offer two questions to complicate our reading. So first, a classic problem in the book of Ruth. Is this a story of return to homeland or of migration to a foreign land? If we read the text as a story of return to the homeland, then the text is about Nomi. But if we read it as a story of migration into a foreign land, then it's about Ruth. This facet of both the biblical narrative and Manger's text resists easy reading, and it serves as a reminder that migration is rarely unidirectional. Second, responding to Hellerstein, is Manger's fragmentary Ruth cycle representative of the whole or representative of the larger biblical text? Usually when we talk about land and landscape in the book of Ruth, we talk about the second chapter of the text when Ruth gleans from the fields, right? That's a practice of land, social and economic justice. So given Manger's focus on such a small portion of the text and on such specific themes, Manger necessarily omits what we would argue would be some of the most important themes of the text, right? This land justice, as well as the continuity of the people of David. How might we read Manger's Ruth cycle, not as a retelling or adaptation of the book of Ruth, but as a rewriting or re-rendering of the biblical text for a new political, cultural, and ecological landscape? Thank you.
So my paper is entitled Beehives and Birdsong, Animals and the Making of New Women, and Alexandra Kollontai and Jente Serdatsky's fiction. In 1921, the Forverts published The Young Widow, Die Junge Almone, a story by the Kovna-born, New York-based Yiddish writer Jente Serdatsky, in which a widow imagines that her pursuit of free love with a married man will transform her into a songbird, unlike the undifferentiated mass of passive hens around her. Quote, not all women must be housewives, just as not all hens and birds must sit atop their eggs in their nests without end. Now she should assume the life of a free songbird. However, in an ensuing nightmare, she peers into the valley, and the mass of hens becomes her sister birds, bearing the names of real women in her life. When she tries to speak to them, she falls, not with the wings of a songbird, but heavy as a rock, crushing everyone. Quote, she peeked into the valley and her heart squeezed in terror. What is this? In the valley, there were piles of eggs with hens sitting on top of them. No, not hens, her sister birds, Aunt Voida. Barely 2 years later, the Soviet writer, theorist, and revolutionary Alexandra Kollontai published her novel, Vasilisa Maligina, in which the heroine's liberation from her relationship with an abusive exploitative nouveau riche net man during the era of Lenin's new economic policy, which I am happy to explain in more detail during the Q&A, should anyone have questions, takes place through her transformation from a passive lizard or yashvitsa that basks in his zoo-like garden before his eyes into an activated subject who is conscious of how the bees, birds, and grasshoppers and frogs in the same garden organize their lives. Quote, live and work, live and love life, like bees in the lilac, like birds in the thick of the garden, like grasshoppers in the grass. These examples demonstrate how two authors working with a shared core literary and theoretical knowledge, but under very different cultural and material conditions, link female subjectivity and the acquisition of political consciousness to the animal world, while coming to conflicting conclusions about the degree to which the ideas encoded by animals can transform women's lives. The proper observation and interpretation of the animal world provides Alexandra Kollontais' reader with an analytical method that she can follow and adhere to become a new woman. Writing primarily for an audience of immigrant Jewish women like herself, the Animals in Yenta Serdatsky's work amplify the desperation of those who seek to reconcile their commitment to radical ideas with the reality of their continued marginalization in every space. This essay is divided into two sections, hive and birdsong, that considers how bees and birds, in particular, are implicated in the author's imagination of women's futures. Since I seek to situate these texts within a broader intellectual genealogy, it is worth mentioning three intellectuals, Charles Fourier, Pyotr Kropotkin, and Emma Goldman, who help us to think through Serdatsky and Kollontais' visions. Charles Fourier's animal-centric utopianism, born out of his disillusionment with the French Revolution, provides an idiosyncratic but instructive and enduring blueprint for community organization and the pursuit of social harmony through labor that shaped leftist projects and literary texts across the world, which I'm happy to also discuss in more detail later. Pyotr Kropotkin's mutual aid was motivated in part by his critical reading of utopian socialists, such as Fourier. And Emma Goldman's engagement with Kropotkin and mobilization of bird-related imagery offer an additional angle for understanding the significance of the animal to 20th century radicals. Additionally, Goldman was both an acquaintance of Kollontai and immersed in the milieu that Serdatsky wrote for in the United States, providing a bridge between both authors and contexts. And in the Q&A, I am happy to describe Goldman's relationship to Kollontai, if it's not already familiar to you, as well as her disdain for Kollontais' justification of Bolshevik repressions after her deportation, which is also an interesting history. So the first section, beehives. The revelation from Kollontais' novel that opens this paper links the transformation of Vasilisa Molygina to her awareness of how bees live and work. The effective relationship of the worker to their labor, which forms through the proper observation of the animal world, is key to Charles Fourier's beehive-based philosophy. Fourier writes that work is, quote, a delight for many creatures, such as beavers, bees, wasps, and ants. And I'll note here that these are perfect animal species, according to him, categorically incapable of any sort of sin or transgression, unlike much more deviant species like pigs. God has provided them with a social mechanism which attracts them to work. Like Fourier, Kropotkin derives harmonious structures from the beehive, but his work also helps us to address intersections between the beehive model, colonialism, and resource extraction that I think are important for thinking through Kollontais' work. Mutual aid prepares us to think about the potentially destructive implications of Kollontais' orientation towards the environment that develops not just in her political writings, but specifically in the literary texts published in the 1920s that I'm interested in. Kropotkin writes, how many human settlers will perish in new countries simply for not having understood the necessity of combining their efforts? By combining their individual intelligences, they succeed in coping with adverse circumstances, even quite unforeseen and unusual, like those bees of the Paris exhibition. Although one might argue that the colonial destruction of nature and native life is an antisocial tendency that violates the principle of mutual aid and will therefore be selected out of the population, this is undoubtedly also a manual, in my opinion, for settlement that relates bees and beehive organizational structures to successful settlement. The same year that she published Vasilisa Molygina, Kollontai released a short story entitled Soon in 48 years, Skåda till det står våsenhet, in which the warning embedded in Kropotkin's description of the hive as a model for settlement comes to the forefront. This story, which takes place on Orthodox Christmas in 1970, deals with the generational divide between the veterans of World Revolution and the young generation. The elderly generation struggles for much of the story to craft real wax candles for their tree, which have become obsolete due to new electrical systems that send power into remote areas. The world is full of identical communes where the only remaining enemy, according to the young generation to overcome, is nature. Youth resolve that this holiday will burn out of existence, using the verb "do'ikayt" that describes how the material of the wax candles on the tree must burn out by the end of the night, in order to make way for their holiday, which is the eternal future. They exclaim, "Let your Christmas tree holiday burn out. Our holiday lies ahead. Life is in the fight, the eternal restless search, not an achievement." Interestingly, the formula that ends this story, a season or life, with a string of 3 qualifiers matches the ending of Vasilisa Maligina almost exactly. However, instead of the trio of animals in Vasilisa Maligina that mark life, here we are left with 2 conditions for what life involves: struggle and the eternally rebellious search, and one that marks what it is not, that is, achievement. The next phase of struggle, according to this story, entails total dominion over nature through a network of hive-like colonies on Earth that will make way for the youth to master the starry sky, which is their main obsession in the story, suggesting a future of colonization that knows no earthly bounds and is facilitated by the hives that they've already developed on Earth. This text, published in the same year as Vasilisa Maligina, raises key questions for how we evaluate Kolontai literary and political philosophy and the centrality of animal knowledge and life ways to it. Is the society in Soon the necessary outcome of Vasilisa Maligina's encounter with the animals in the garden? That is, after extracting needed information about how to live from attention to these animals, to the bees, to the birds, etc., as Vasilisa does, do the animals themselves cease to matter to the revolution's inheritors? Is it a problem for Kolontai that the children relate to nature in this way? And what might the consequences of their oversight be? Publishing these texts concurrently with such structural and linguistic parallels invites us to consider them as part of a dialogue on what the future's dependency on and obligations towards the animal are. The beehive surfaces throughout Emma Goldman's account of her experiences in living my life as well, most notably in her recollection of an anarchist school in France. She admires the French priest turned anarchist Sébastien Felder for the pedagogy of his school for impoverished children, La Ruche, the beehive, which ran between 1904 and 1917. This phrase was adopted by Fourierists across time and space in newspapers, including the La Ruche Populaire newspaper that ran during the 1830s and 40s, the famed La Ruche Artistic Colony in Montparnasse, founded in 1902, and André Breton's lectures on surrealism and Haiti and correspondences with members of the Haitian avant-garde in the 1940s. Goldman commends La Ruche for its, quote, hand-painted wallpaper, picturing the life of plants, flowers, birds, and animals, which had a more quickening effect on the imagination of the children than any regular lessons. And this, I think, links back to Caleb and Cecile's discussions of pedagogy yesterday and the role of nature in pedagogy, because Goldman reads the drawings of plants and animals as a pathway to channeling a child's creative capacity. This education does not automatically result in the total clarity afforded to Vasilisa Maligina in the garden, but Goldman does speak to the radical educative potential of an encounter with animals and plants, even in a drawn form, in a manner that resonates with the same process that Vasilisa undergoes. Learning how to see into the harmony of the beehive and the natural world and implement its lessons to model a new life does not translate for Serdatsky. In She Waits, a story from 1922, an elderly woman refuses to delight in or even look at nature because it masks endless scenes of poverty and desperation. Quote, lots of windows are opened. Mothers and children poke their heads out of the windows and revel in God's world. At this moment, she closes the window. Lit up neighbors' windows reveal sorrowful portraits. There is no knowledge to be gleaned from looking at nature's harmony that can mitigate real suffering. There are no bees in this particular story, but there is a rejection of exactly what the beehive offers and teaches Kolontai Vasilisa Maligina, which is a template for a rejuvenated self and society to be gleaned through the embodied appreciation and activation of nature's structural and aesthetic composition. Beehives invite a question that is at stake for both Kolontai and Serdatsky. which is whether the lessons encoded in the animal world and natural landscape trains people to better and more ethically interpret their environment and what this means for women. Serdatsky's 1913 legend, Der Künstler, the artist, discusses how this problem plays out when the subject is not an immigrant woman, but a powerful male artist with seemingly boundless talent. In this tale, an artist prays for a theme for his work because he believes that everything has already been painted. At which point, a so-called divine voice, but what may very well be his own voice, again, Cole, tells him to embark on a search for new impressions. Every scene that he considers as a potential theme centers on women, and his fading reaction to them correspondingly and literally dulls his perception of nature and its animals, so that even the most remarkable creatures and landscapes lose color and distinction. The first subject that excites him is a girl reading a book under an apple tree. However, he quickly becomes disillusioned by this voice that tells him she is not original in any way, which causes the entire landscape to become boring to him again. And in turn, his eye perceived everywhere the old in uniform, the same people, the same statues, the same houses, forests, and fields. He reads the ocean, sky, and mountains through the female body's subjection to male power. For example, the blue water faces the sky like a gehorsam vibe, a pagan man, an obedient woman facing her husband, and wondrous animals abound in this landscape, including multicolored birds and lions, but he disregards them entirely. How the artist sees nature, or really does not see it, and its animals, is a direct consequence of how he consumes and discards images of women. His audience celebrates his lifeless portraits anyway, and he has a very successful career, demonstrating that even the most miraculous animals and landscapes are not enough to correct or redirect the exploitative gaze this artist shares with the rest of the world. Part 2, bird songs. Moving from the beehive to birdsong underscores the centrality of voice to the issues of community organization and creative agency that occupy both Serdatsky and Kollontai. To return to Serdatsky's The Young Widow, the woman's attempt to speak to her newly recognized sister birds in her nightmare is catastrophic. Khvayles usefully describes how hunting birds make alert calls that bring the other birds to a site of a hunt. Quote, "One saw an eagle," referring to another naturalist, "rising high in the air. Its cry was soon answered by another eagle who approached it, and was followed by a third, a fourth, and so on." The widow in Serdatsky's text is incapable of fulfilling the function of a signaling bird that pulls its group members into a shared space of prosperity and survival. Her voice is a deadweight. While the young widow might appear to suggest that a better outcome would have been possible had the woman sensed the shared condition faced by herself and her sister birds before it was too late in this nightmare, the flock in Serdatsky's other stories is a numbingly cruel environment that values neither solidarity nor creativity. In Without a Song, published in her collected writings in 1913, a bird tires of the familiar songs of her flock and resolves to fly to heaven to learn original songs from the angels. This bird hopes that her pursuit will benefit the entire community by freeing them from their mundanity. However, when she reaches the heavens, the angels reproduce the same exact melodies the birds already sing, explaining that heaven is no more than the reflection of the earth. Heaven is only the reflection of the earth. Our song is only the echo of your songs. When she protests, the sky caves in. The bird barely makes it back to her home, where she sees that her nest has been destroyed. Her community completely abandons her. Quote, "She could no longer sing together with her friends. Lonely and alone, the bird flies from one tree to the other, lonely without friends, without a home, and without a song." Her search brings her outside of the group, which punishes her terribly for disrupting the patterns of their lives. In her study of the Scottish poet Thomas Clarke's poetic declaration that, quote, "There is no shadow with enough density to impede a song, no song with enough weight to bend a willow branch," Harriet Tarlow argues that there is an embedded, and these are Harriet's words, hope that language itself might be part of the earthy, sensory, and textural world. It is precisely this balanced integration of a new song, a living sound, into the landscape and its community that evades the bird and Without a Song. The dense shadow for Serdatsky's bird is the impenetrable, totalizing heavenly opulence, defended by the angels and her own kin alike, that rejects the bird for her desire to sing and hear in new ways. Indeed, as I listened to Anna-Lena Torres's description of Chagall's depiction of the pen piercing the mirror that writes to beard and initiates a creative act and accompanied Sutzkever's beard during introductions to yesterday's panels, I thought of this opulence, located in an imaginary boundary between the angels and the earth, which defies the bird's attempt to shatter the stagnant reflection of her community's song and life to create something new. When the angels expel the bird, it is their resounding insistence on the impossibility of new independent speech, manifested by a literal thunderstorm that directly shadows her world and her nest. However, it is the choice of her fellow birds to abandon her that silences her. Emma Goldman's explanation of the relationship between birds and liberation resonates with Serdatsky's birds. She repeatedly mentions instances when her crowds seem to transform into birds. After a speech at Union Square, she writes that uproarious applause, wild and deafening, broke from the stillness like a sudden storm. The sea of hands eagerly stretching out towards me seemed like the wings of white birds fluttering. Unlike the punitive storm inflicted by the angels on the transgressive bird in Serdatsky's text, here it is the crowd's meeting with Goldman's words that initiates a productive storm, one capable of almost rendering human listeners capable of a flock's flight out of the conditions that repress them. For Serdatsky, this process, bringing a new song to a collective that can initiate action, metamorphosis, and solidarity, breaks down catastrophically. Birds and Kolonthai's Vasilisa Malikina are markers of the gradual development of Vasilisa's consciousness. Their song matters not on its own terms, but functions as what I call a translation exercise or exam that reveals the obstacles that Vasilisa has yet to overcome in her development. When Vasilisa is still devoted to the prospect of salvaging her relationship with Vladimir, she confuses frogs for birds. Frogs croak. At first, Vasya thought they were night birds. This moment of confusion reflects her misinterpretation of Vladimir's character. Even though she thinks everything is in fact clearer, more understandable, and happier, yasnее, понятнее, радостнее, she fails to grasp his true nature, just as she misinterprets the animals' sounds in the garden. The next time the birds appear, Vasilisa, correctly this time, admires how birds call to each other, wondering why a person cannot remain forever in the bushes and become like an animal. However, she runs away from the bird song because at this point she is not yet ready to separate from Vladimir and start her new life. She must choose not to turn away from the animals to meaningfully integrate her life into their world and vice versa. The bees, birds, and other animals in Serdatsky and Kolonthai's texts, and how these creatures and the landscapes they belong to matter to leftist histories that inform them, is essential to discerning and evaluating the proposed solutions constructed by Kolonthai and Serdatsky for the women they know are and write for. In her reading of the story of Balaam's donkey from Bamidbar, Beth Berkowitz, in Animals and Animality in the Babylonian Talmud, writes that, quote, when the story describes the donkey's mouth being open, it presumes that prior to that moment, the donkey's mouth was closed, even though brain constitutes speech, albeit not a speech in which human beings are fluent. Going forward, I am interested in what Kolonthai and Serdatsky allow animals to say and what these creatures make possible for the women and environment that these authors wish to reimagine. At the same time, and I'm very much still working through this, so I'd be interested on your thoughts, I think that it is important to be attuned to when the animals and their texts only get to have a voice, so long as it is legible and actionable to humans. And in doing so, I hope to understand what animals mean and offer to the models of agency and community tested by Kolonthai and Serdatsky. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for your papers. I mean, I think these three panels, I think centering female gender, as you all did, really makes visible the entanglements of the human body with nature in ways that are super interesting. I don't want to take up too much time because I already got to talk. Would you like to talk to each other for a little bit before you hear some questions? I don't see people. So,
Sure.
okay.
I have a question, for
You
you,
have to use this if you don't mind.
and I have a question for you, Hannah, and for Hinde as well. So I'm struck that all of our projects speak to fertility. You quite literally with birds and bees, right? In that in that imagery, and then Hinde, of course, with menstruation as well. So I'm curious if that is something that comes up in your work at all, and Hinde, if that's a theme that you see emerge.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. And I think that fertility and motherhood are issues that I'm interested in exploring further through other animals as they come up. In terms of the pairing of the birds and the bees, I think that there is definitely a resonance to that in terms of the idea of the colony and the hive. and in creating this kind of endless stream of energy for Kollontai that we see, for example, in Skorda Chigas Sorta Kvosimleet, the story called Soon, or translated as Soon. And so I'm interested in thinking about that versus more how animals might model more intimate relationships or help us to see through to interiority, which is a word that I got from your presentation for Kollontai and Serdatsky, because for me, what I've been thinking a lot about is how they're modeling basically through animals instructions for women to follow or that they're not able to follow and therefore kind of remain trapped in the same situation. And I think that part of the way of thinking around that and through that requires thinking about whether there are moments, as I was kind of hinting at in this talk, where the animals get to speak and whether there's kind of a more intimate or personal relationship that's possible that can kind of counteract maybe some of the more damaging tendencies of the hive. Yeah.
I'll try and make sense at this early hour. I think that's a really wonderful observation, and I think yes, I can see fertility as an emerging theme, not only in Kholodenko's writing, but in a lot of writing by Yiddish women poets in the 1910s and the 1920s. And I think it's very interesting because for some it's about the connection of nature and fertility. For many, it's about the issue of control of fertility and a beginning, I guess, of rejecting the assumption that you have to have children, and that as a woman, as a fertile woman, you need to give birth to children. And I think, for me, that's a really fascinating aspect, how different women poets negotiate fertility. It's also fascinating to me that for Shifre Kholodenko, that she is writing about these topics at such a very young age. I mean, we all know that historically, Jewish women were expected or heralded into childbirth at a very young age, but it still seems to me very remarkable reading that today. So yeah, I think it's an important theme in Yiddish writing that merits more explanation.
Yeah, can I follow up with a question for both of you that I think connects both of your papers? I was interested in the idea of embodiment as it relates to both of your projects. Embodiment, for example, in the Kholodenko series as opening up, on the one hand, leading into the interiority of the experience, but also opening up and connecting to these much wider, more active, more dynamic landscapes. I was thinking of the sounds of the waves churning, etc., as you were talking about her work, and then embodiment in its many stages that you discuss as well. So I was wondering if you could extend on that.
Sure.
I'll take that.
Yeah.
Hinde, do you want to go first?
No.
Thanks, Hinde. Yes,
I'm using the tired privilege.
You're all good. This is so true, and that was a theme I picked up as well. I'm so interested in. I think that it is working on multiple levels. The grief is definitely embodied, and the grief is made manifest also in the natural world. And so it's not just in the human body, but right, with like the mill, which works with the land, right? It helps to produce sustenance. The mill becomes a sign symbol of loss as well. So I certainly think that, yeah, it's so essential. Thank you. All right, Hinde, it's your turn now.
Okay. My brain is fading. Yeah, I think that's also a really interesting question. And for me, what's really interesting is the way that Kholodenko uses nature to embody her experiences and the sort of a body of water and the body of the menstruating speaker. I think that the connection between the two is, for me, really, really powerful. And I think again that's a motif we can see often in poetry of the time as women gained greater agency over their own bodies. We see more embodiment in their writing. Yeah.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions here in the audience that you can't see, but I'm good. You're gonna write it, Berg?
Thank you. I'm doing Berg here.
Okay, well, thank you. That was really fantastic, and I really appreciate, among other things, the great translations and the sources that are being made available. I hope you don't mind if we use them. I took a picture, as some other people did. I don't know if they're copywritten yet or if they're still in progress. I don't know if maybe afterwards we can pull resources that are in progress and see if they're usable by us who are looking for teaching materials, because these are really great and useful. I apologize for Hinde for exercising your mind at such a late hour for you, but I was fascinated, among other things, by your discussion of these poems in the context of communist anti-clericalism. So here she is. If we take that framework, she's, according to you, she's sort of seeing this poetic project as resonant with an overall Bolshevik overturning of religious dogma, also by presumably bourgeois, conventionality and so forth. And yet the poems also seem so radical and transgressive. I wonder if they harmonized with the Bolshevik movement, if there are tensions between the two, if she's sort of so I guess, how much do we know about her engagement with the radical political culture? I mean, is it in line with that? Is it part of are these poems forwarding the goals of the revolution? Or did they complicate that? And I guess that kind of gets to the beehive metaphor as well. I mean, is she working in tandem, or is it more of the birdsong, independent freedom?
Great question.
Those are just some.
Yeah, great question. I guess I'll start by saying she was aged between 13 and 19 when she wrote the poems, or when she published the poems. So, I think her engagement is both as a young person taken up with new ideas, but also as someone who's rebelling from a very traditional religious background. So I think in that respect, it's interesting. I think if we look broader at writing by Yiddish women in Ukraine in this time, then you see it's this very interesting paradox to me of, on one hand, being very rebellious in rejecting religious impositions, but in doing so, it is also following the dictates of the state, or the desires of the state, that will absolutely value writing that rejects religion, and will not support writing that doesn't reject religion. I think Kholodenko is really interesting because she actually shows the tension in the two, in smuggling in more traditional religious imagery and concepts in a way that could easily be acceptable to the state. And so I think she walks a very fine step there. She's, as I said, she straddles two perspectives. In terms of her long-term, her life, it's fascinating to me that she remained in the Soviet Union her entire life. Her brother, as I said, David Hofstein, was the first of the Soviet Yiddish writers to be murdered. And she, in her Schuflod, sorry, I think in Yiddish, in the drawer of her desk, after her death, one of the poems that was found was questioning what had happened. It doesn't directly name her brother, but it's assumed to be about her brother. And in that, she's saying, maybe it didn't really happen. Nobody was there. Nobody saw it. Maybe he wasn't murdered. Maybe he'll appear tomorrow and I'll see him again. And so from that, I understand both also a sense of denial, but also how deep her belief could have been in the Soviet state, that she didn't want to believe that something so terrible had occurred, even though it became apparent that it had. So I think she walks a very interesting line, and she was so young. So how things developed later on, it's so hard to know because, of course, as time went on, so much is silenced. All those, and when I talk about it being a poem of its time, it wouldn't have been able to be published 20 years later, because of the silences that existed. So I don't know if that answers your question at all, but yeah.
I think we need to, yes, that was what you were there.
I had a question.
Oh, you have a question? Oh, okay. Okay. Well, we have, maybe we'll gather the last question. Because I don't want to throw the rest of the conference off schedule. So I'll gather there.
I'll be quick. If I stand here, can
Yeah,
you see me for a sec?
Oh, yeah, she can.
Thank you. Hi, thank you. Thank you for these beautiful papers. All of them featured marvelous translations. And I'm curious whether there are particular nuances, considerations, or challenges for you when it comes to translating an ecological text.
Can we gather the questions? Because I know there was one. Oh, wait, Anna, there was one here that was first.
Sure.
Sorry.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah Orshamira from Association for Study of Women in Mythology. And I was really struck by the way I'm curious about how you see the writers specifically, as opposed to the characters, dance between cultivated and wild spaces, like the difference between the chickens and the wild birds, and many other examples of, and how that related to just the context that they were writing in.
Hannah, just a question for you. I know towards the end, we were trying to sort of get us to resist a little bit of the reading of the instrumentalization of, these animal metaphors for merely, political ends and political purposes. But I guess, and maybe this question helps in that, and maybe it doesn't. But I'm curious, do you think for Serdatsky or for Kollontai, is there anything that birdsong can teach us about the organization of labor and bees can teach us about the acquisition of subjectivity? Sort of reverse the states.
Question is also for Hannah about the comment at the end of how animals are demanded to practice a kind of legibility in text sometimes, and whether that is gendered to some degree, and what symbolic significance that kind of demanded legibility has in relation to the demanded legibility of Jews in a marginalized status in Europe.
That was a great set of questions. Thank you, guys. The first one was about translating ecology, wild versus cultivated, not just political. Okay, yeah.
Okay. Great. Yeah. So the question about legibility and translation is one that I was thinking about, because unlike some of the other projects that I've had the privilege of seeing, Serdatsky and Kollontai don't use extremely specific nature language. It's pretty run of the mill. There's bees, there's birds, there's frogs. They croak. Sometimes there's like lilacs, if we're getting more advanced, but there's not there's not like a really careful attention to the specificity of the plant or the animal. And I was thinking about that too in relationship to what Fourier's work in philosophy presumes, which is that there are animals and they are in types and in species, and each one has a function, and they're mapped onto a personality in a particular way, and there's no way out of that. And so I think that that's something that I've been struggling with and thinking about with both of these writers. And so for me, that's something that I've been thinking about indirectly as I've been translating. But I'll pass it to you.
Thank you. So first to speak to the cultivated and wild question that kind of has helped to open a layer of analysis that I hadn't considered, so thank you. So for Manger, the Manger places the women in a cultivated environment. The women are working the land. And really the only place that we see wild land is with the local woman who sings a song. And her song echoes through the wild landscape. So I think there's a reading that could be possible that cultivated land is part of the women's estrangement from the land. Part of the reason why they're struggling to connect it and what to leave. And then on translation, I briefly mentioned kind of one translation possibility, which was that we rendered a word as corpses.
Original.
It was from the root cover.
Hey,
Yeah. Because because of autonomy, I'm thinking, oh well, a gash in the earth can't speak. Corpse can speak, but a gash in the earth can't speak. So it does point to a choice in translation, but could certainly be rendered.
Do you want to?
Yeah, I'm happy to comment on translation as well. I think for me in this translation, it wasn't so much the nature imagery as the incredible way that Kholodenko actually captured the rhythm of the waves in her poem, in Ecologies. And that for me was a challenge in trying to replicate that rhythm. It's a deceptively simple poem, as in it appears simple and you can see that the construction was actually not so simple. And so, yeah, for me, it was more about capturing the sounds of the movement of nature, of the movement of the waves. That was really challenging. And because it's short lines, that can be very challenging. Particularly, I wanted to follow her rhyme scheme in the first poem because I felt that was an important aspect of the poem. In the second one also, you may have noticed there's one point where in Yiddish, ich hab geweint, ich hab gelacht, and that rhymes with Nacht. And in the English, I've done it as I laughed, I cried. So I've reversed the order so that cried, it's not a very good rhyme with night, but it works better than nothing, I guess. So yeah, yeah,
It was a pleasure
really
to
the
hear you read it.
rhythms.
It was a pleasure to hear you read it. And I guess we should say good enough. And I think we have to close out the panel, but we'll have a short coffee break. And I turn it over to the organizers, but I want to thank you all for your participation.
Thanks to my co-panelists, you were amazing. It was really beautiful. So worth staying awake for.
10-minute coffee break.